I had this humiliating moment recently where I realized I've started using Google the way people use an inhaler, not for curiosity, but for basic survival. Like my brain will suddenly go blank on something I should know, and instead of thinking it through, I panic and type it in because I don't trust my own education to have left anything permanent in my head. I'm 28 years old, and I had to look up where Afghanistan is. Afghanistan, a place my country has been involved with for basically my entire adult life. 20 years of headlines, speeches, support the troops, endless debates, and I'm staring at a map like it's a surprise quiz. And the worst part wasn't just me. It's that I'm not an exception. A huge chunk of Americans can't point to Afghanistan even after nearly 2 decades of war. We can recite details about conflicts from a century ago like we're studying mythology, but we can't locate the countries we've actually bombed, occupied, negotiated with, or destabilized in real time. That should scare people more than it does, because geography isn't trivia when your nation has missiles. Geography is accountability. If you don't know where a place is, you don't understand who borders it, what region it's in, why it matters, what other countries get pulled into the mess, what refugees cross which routes, how trade and oil and alliances fit together. Without the map, all foreign policy becomes vibes. You end up with opinions that are basically just emotions attached to words. That's not informed citizenship. That's fandom. Then it got worse. In the same "what is wrong with me" spiral, I Googled how many countries are in Africa and discovered it's 54. 54. And I had this sick realization that, for way too long, I carried Africa in my head like it was one single place, like a backdrop, like a category. I'm college educated. I've spoken confidently about Africa, like it's one story, one culture, one reality. And I'm sitting there realizing how many people from actual African countries must have listened to Americans like me and had to resist rolling their eyes into the back of their skull. It was crushing, not because I'm uniquely stupid, but because it exposes what American schooling does. It teaches you to flatten the world into stereotypes you can hold in one hand: poverty, safaris, charity commercials, rather than actual nations with histories, politics, languages, cities, art, science, and contradictions. And it's not just global stuff, it's our own system. I once had to Google the 3 branches of US government because my brain blanked. Not the names of obscure agencies, the basic structure. I've voted. I've argued about Supreme Court decisions. I've had opinions about laws and executive actions. And for a moment, I couldn't even pull judicial out of my head without checking my phone. That's embarrassing on a personal level, sure, but zoom out, and it's terrifying. Because most people don't know this either. You end up with a democracy where citizens are passionate but civically illiterate, screaming about policy with no understanding of the machinery that creates it. And then you start noticing how often American confidence is built on missing information. I was in a conversation and somebody mentioned Puerto Rico, and I caught myself wondering if it's part of the US, like it's a random foreign island. So I Googled it. Yes, Puerto Rico is a US territory. Puerto Ricans are US citizens. Now, I'm 30 and learned that from a search bar, not from school. And it gets worse. Most Americans can't name the US territories, can't explain what that status means, and don't know the difference between citizenship, statehood, and representation. We talk about freedom and democracy constantly while having people who live under our flag without full political power, and the average American doesn't even know they exist. Same story with NATO. I've heard the acronym my entire life. Politicians throw it around like it's the weather. So when someone brought it up in conversation, I nodded like I understood. Later, I had to look it up. What it stands for, why it exists, what it commits countries to, why it matters. And again, the part that makes me angry isn't that I didn't know one acronym. It's that we live in a country where you can grow up surrounded by global power and never be taught the basics of how that power is organized. So we become adults who can argue about alliances, interventions, and wars without knowing what the words actually mean. Then there's the language ignorance that American schools basically encourage by omission. I once Googled what language people speak in Brazil because I assumed it was Spanish, like South America equals Spanish is some natural law. It's Portuguese. Brazil was colonized by Portugal. This is not obscure knowledge. And yet American education makes it so easy to walk around with a cartoon map of the world where entire continents have one language and one culture and one identity. And then Americans travel and act shocked that the world didn't simplify itself for our convenience. At some point, it stops being funny and starts feeling like a deliberate design, like we're trained to memorize facts long enough to pass a test and then drop them. Nothing sticks because the goal was never understanding. It was performance. You get graded, you move on, you forget. And years later, you're an adult Googling things you definitely learned but can't retrieve. Because your brain was trained for temporary storage, not for building a mental model of reality. I had a moment during a trivia game where I second-guessed the number of US states. Not because I don't know it's 50, I do know it's 50. But the doubt hit me anyway, and I checked my phone because I didn't trust my own memory, and everyone looked at me like I was insane. That's the humiliating part of this system. It doesn't just fail to teach you, it teaches you not to trust yourself. And once the doubt spiral starts, it gets ridiculous. I've had moments where I've Googled which one orbits which, the Earth and the Sun, because for 1 second I couldn't remember. For 1 second, my brain turned basic astronomy into a coin flip. I'm not proud of that. But I also know why it happens. When your education is mostly memorized fragments instead of understanding, even simple things can feel shaky under pressure. You're not building confidence from knowledge. You're borrowing it from Google. This is what American education produces too often. Adults who speak loudly about politics, history, foreign countries, science, while secretly running on half-remembered slogans and last-minute searches. And that combination, confidence without foundation, isn't just embarrassing. It's dangerous. After that first wave of embarrassment, I started realizing how deep the rot goes. It isn't just, I forgot a fact. It's that there are holes in the foundation so big you can fall through them, and the system acts like that's normal. You can graduate, vote, argue, post opinions, feel righteous, while missing basic information that should be automatic in a functioning society. I remember Googling what the First Amendment actually includes during a political argument. I knew it was free speech, sure, but I couldn't list the rest without checking. Religion, press, assembly, petition, 5 rights people treat like sacred scripture while barely remembering the words. That's the part that makes me cringe. Americans constantly invoke the Constitution like it's a weapon, but so many of us can't quote what we're defending. We argue about rights we can't name. We fight over sentences we can't recite. It's like being in a screaming match over a book you've never opened. Then there's the Washington, D.C. thing. I had to look up whether D.C. is a state. It isn't. It's a federal district. And the implications are wild. People live there, pay taxes, can vote for president, but they don't have voting representation in Congress the way states do. I didn't learn that in school. I learned it the way modern Americans learn everything embarrassing, privately, on a phone, hoping nobody sees. And once you see that, you start asking a darker question. Why are we so uninformed about the structure of our own democracy? Why do we treat civic knowledge like optional trivia? Even the simplest, how many continents are there question can turn into a moment of doubt because education doesn't teach concepts. It teaches flashcards. I've seen adults blank on 6 versus 7 because different systems teach it differently. That's not the problem. The problem is how many Americans don't know why it's taught differently, or what continents even represent, or how geography connects to climate, migration, trade, war. We learn labels, not models, and labels evaporate. I once had to Google which ocean sits between the US and Europe because my mind went empty. The Atlantic. Of course it's the Atlantic, but I still had that blank moment, and it made me realize something. If you can't picture the oceans, you can't picture the planet. And if you can't picture the planet, you can't understand anything that actually matters. Climate, shipping routes, alliances, conflicts, pandemics, energy, food. You're just reacting to headlines with no map in your head. That's how a country becomes easy to manipulate. Not because people are evil, because people are ungrounded, and it shows up in the dumbest arguments too. I once had someone insist Mexico is Central America, and instead of calmly correcting them, I had to Google it because I didn't want to be wrong. Mexico is in North America. We share a massive border. This shouldn't be controversial. Yet Americans debate basic facts about our own neighbors like it's a sports rivalry. And we do it with confidence. That's the curse. We don't know, but we don't know we don't know. History isn't safe either, Because American education doesn't just omit, sometimes it actively blurs. I had a moment where I doubted who won the Civil War. I'm not kidding. I know the Union won. I know the Confederacy lost. But the fact that doubt even happened tells you something. When schools teach states' rights as the centerpiece and treat slavery like a side note, they muddy the story until the facts feel less firm. They take a brutal, clear moral reality and turn it into a foggy argument. And in that fog, people lose certainty about what should be obvious. That isn't education, that's narrative management. The Holocaust knowledge collapse scared me the most. I once had to check what Auschwitz was during a conversation because my mind went blank for a second. I knew the word. I knew it was horrific. But the fact that my brain could hesitate at all, that's what terrified me. Because it's not just me. A disturbing number of people can't name a single concentration camp. Holocaust memory is fading while survivors are still alive. And when memory fades, denial grows teeth. Ignorance creates space for monsters to rewrite history in broad daylight, and people can't fight back because they don't have the facts. Then I looked up how many people died in World War II and realized I didn't understand the scale. Tens of millions. A number so large it stopped sounding real. And it made me angry at how American schooling frames global events. We learn the American chapters in high resolution, our battles, our heroes, our turning points, but the world's suffering becomes background. We don't sit with the true cost, the global dead, the countries that lost entire generations. We learn we helped win, but we don't learn who bled the most or how the trauma shaped nations. That isn't a neutral omission. That shapes how Americans see themselves. Always central, always the protagonist. Economics is another embarrassment zone. I've heard GDP 1,000 times in news and debates, and realized one day I couldn't define it cleanly. So I looked it up. Gross domestic product, total value of goods and services produced. Basic. And yet, most people never learn practical economic literacy. We learn slogans, taxes bad, markets good, debt scary, without understanding the definitions behind the words. So adults vote based on vibes about inflation, deficits, trade, and wages without knowing what any of it means. We're politically emotional and economically illiterate at the same time, which is basically a cheat code for anyone trying to manipulate the public. Even the democracy versus republic talking point proves how easy it is to confuse people who don't have civic grounding. I had to look it up because I kept hearing, "We're not a democracy, we're a republic," like those are opposites. They're not. A republic can be democratic. The U.S. is a representative democracy, democratic republic. But that line gets repeated to muddy the water, to make democracy sound optional, like voting power is a cute preference. And it works because the education system leaves people without the vocabulary to resist nonsense. I even Googled how many amendments are in the Constitution. 27. I could name maybe 3 with confidence, and a 4th as a joke. And that's the point. We treat the Constitution like a holy object while being unable to describe its contents. It's ceremonial, not understood. It's identity, not knowledge. And then you zoom back out to foreign policy, and it gets bleak again. I had to look up where Iraq is on a map. Iraq, a country the U.S. invaded, occupied, fought in, argued about for years. Thousands of Americans died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died, and a huge chunk of Americans can't locate it. That's not a small gap. That's a moral failure. How can you consent to war, support it, oppose it, debate it, vote on leaders who start it, without even knowing where it is? If you can't locate a place, you can't understand what intervention means. You can't see the neighboring countries, the region, the consequences. You're voting on destruction in a fog. And once I realized all of this, I couldn't unsee the bigger pattern. American education doesn't produce informed citizens. It produces people trained to sound certain. We learn to talk, we learn to perform, we learn to win arguments. But we don't learn the world. We don't learn systems. We don't learn context. We learn enough to feel superior and not enough to be responsible with the power our country holds. That's why this isn't just embarrassing. It's terrifying. Because democracy isn't supposed to run on confidence. It's supposed to run on informed people. And if we're not informed, then we're not really steering the ship. We're just yelling on the deck while someone else holds the wheel.